We are recording.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we're just a minute past 7, but I think we'll get started with some of the beginning pieces while people are still joining us. First of all, I want to thank people for joining us. This is the first of a 3-part webinar on Cuba. And it's also our first webinar ever. So you might see a few of the rough edges that normally would be behind the curtain, but we appreciate you joining us. And my name is Marilyn McKenna. I'm CRLN's Cuba Program Coordinator. And tonight's presenter will be Daisy Hernandez. We've been very fortunate that Daisy has worked with CRLN in the summer of 2019 and the summer of 2020. At the end of 2019, she went to Cuba with the Witness for Peace delegation and created this webinar series from her reflections from that experience. So during the presentation, feel free to put questions in the question box. And also I put some links in the chat box of places to go for more information. Because I'm new to chat, I think I put them in twice, but you'll be able to figure it out. And then I wanted to also thank today and introduce Sharon Hunter Smith. She is our human rights coordinator. She'll be gathering questions during the session, and then we'll be working through those after about the first half hour. And also introduce Juan Carlos Hernandez. He is our immigration program coordinator, and he's doing the technical behind the scenes work that make calls like this possible. So I want to thank them both for their work on this, and a big thank you to Alianza Americas, who lent us their platform for this, and even more importantly, gave us training to help us use it. So at CRLN, we've been working for more than 25 years to end sanctions against Cuba as a result of hearing directly from a Cuban pastor about the experiences people had with these sanctions. So in that long tradition, we've had many report backs, and we've all done a lot of work to end sanctions, and that work goes on. But tonight, I'm very happy to bring you to our very first virtual report back. So we'll be doing more of these, and I'm going to give it to Daisy, and she'll take it away.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, staff, for supporting me in this effort today. And thank you to everybody that's joined us to learn about Cuba today. As Marilyn mentioned, this past December, I was fortunate to have been able to assist the Healing Our Land, Healing Ourselves delegation with the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective by gracious contributions of CRLN members like yourselves through the Hyde Camp Scholarship. So thank you all for joining us and your continued participation with CRLN today. If you haven't met me before, I'm entering my 4th year of undergraduate studies at Marquette, where I'm working consciously towards becoming an avid peacemaker and peace builder and social justice proponent in these times, and last summer, as Marilyn mentioned. My experience volunteering with CRLN for the 2nd summer now has been as rewarding as my first in the realm of non-violence advocacy, and it's ultimately what led me to embark on this journey with 16 strangers with Witness for Peace. So I've gained more than just the community CRLN has offered me. It's offered me these opportunities to study internationally and bridge the learned theory and action that I'm working towards. So thankfully I came across this delegation with Witness for Peace, and I'm able to continue using all of the resources that I can possible to deliver this message with you today, using some facts and some knowledge based off the community advocates that we met with and some permaculturists, and learning about the holistic healing methodology. So I'm very pleased to share with you all that and the socioeconomic implications of the blockade on Cuba that are continued efforts for decades now, but this is still really important work to be doing, and spending only 10 days there was not nearly enough to divulge into the large scale effects of a powerful country like the US on a country like Cuba. So I'll try to scale it all into a slideshow for everybody today. So we begin part one, day one of my 3-part series on my experience with urban economics and agriculture. So here I am on my Healing Our Land, Healing Ourselves delegation in the home of an artist who invited us to socialize with her alongside participants of the Black Socialist Strategies and Holistic Healing delegation. It was a very lovely evening. We learned a lot. It was very different experience to be able to socialize with community members in Cuba, aside from the itinerary and planned events with the delegation. It was my 9-year-old friend who prompted me to take this picture in front of the pride flag. She has 2 mothers, and I also identify with the LGBT community, so I thought that was a very cute photo to include. Below the title, I also included what the flyer that captivated me from Witness for Peace read. It read, "On this delegation, social workers, educators, and first responders, those who hold and experience trauma, will exchange with Cuban organizers and healers to share strategies for community organizing, environmental justice, and nurturing." Through holistic healing myself, I've learned of my intergenerational trauma as a first-generation Mexican, and this delegation could not have been more timely for myself. Everybody, I'm sure, has a place in mind, a dream place they'd like to travel, and that place was always Cuba for me. So I feel very at peace that I was able to learn a lot of what I'm passionate about from the Cuban people, and also got to experience that for myself. I would like to mention that this did not stem from just my identity. It also stemmed from my consciousness towards Latin American issues generally. So I started off just in my AP Spanish courses in high school, learning about Latin America and the effects of US imperialism essentially on Latin America, and what the current socio-political status is. And Cuba, as a post-revolutionary country, was a place that bridged all of these interests, as well as continued work that I'd like to be a part of. So outside of the Centro Martin Luther King Center, which we stayed at, was this graphic asking, ¿Por qué luchamos? Also, why do we fight? And anybody could pretty much write a message on why they are continuing, not necessarily a fight, but an adjustment towards justness and peace in each of these countries. If you've hopped on this webinar, you are obviously aware of the effects of globalization, imperialism, colonialism on each of these Latin American countries, and that was people's similar experience, just able to write it down in a collaborative and meaningful way. So as a CRLN staff, I'd like to take a moment to also recognize that human rights violations happening in Honduras that have been brought to light in the news recently, at least among our network, where leaders of the Garifuna community have disappeared, but were also kidnapped by men in bulletproof vests and into unmarked vehicles. So our main event guest speaker, Miriam Miranda, drew attention to issues this community faces, but they are one of the many that CRLN stands with and we support as an organization. So I just felt the need to amplify that today as we are looking at the map. Another reason I was very excited to join this delegation was because we would explore factors such as imperialism, capitalism, and environmental racism, which inhibit peace and justice throughout the Americas, and imagine communities of well-being and nurturing, enabling economic and food justice for our movements in the US and allies in Cuba. So the main takeaway of my webinar today, and I think the experience, cumulative my experience in Cuba, was the effort to imagine communities of well-being and nurturing. This is something that we can learn from a country like Cuba. And living under capitalism, it's very difficult for us to imagine communities of well-being and nurturing with the competitive edge and competition that a system like capitalism breeds. So I want to keep that in mind as the main goal of today's series, part one of the series. So I'll start off giving a little bit of context on the country of Cuba itself. Cuba, after the socialist bloc, is where we'll start in 1989, which was the end of Cuba's trade with the socialist bloc, is really what affected all sectors of the Cuban economy and what motivated it to change because of the food and energy crisis, which hit throughout the 90s, in which the export structure changed from sugar exports to tourism for the economy, as is true for a lot of Caribbean countries. So Cuba had to be imaginative with little capital, few markets, and a lot of adjustments were made, considering that few foreign investments were made besides with other socialist countries as well. The question of poverty and inequality is important to keep in mind as a forefront when talking about another country, especially from a position of living in a rich country, because in most regards, Cuba has been successful in extending access to free social services, as has been the primary goal since the revolution. So how we as Americans view poverty and inequality is important to consider. Poverty looks like people don't have very much. Absolute poverty looks like people have nothing at all. And inequality, we understand some have more than others. So any article you might read on globalization will tell you that globalized and rich nations like the US have seen a fall in absolute poverty, but there's a rise in inequalities. Presidential candidates have tried to run platforms on this, the idea of the 1%, the rich keep getting richer. We see this happening even in light of a pandemic. You can look to projected statistics of individuals becoming trillionaires or tripling their wealth even during the pandemic. And in reality, it's the issue of hoarding wealth, and we are seeing the effects of all that, and have been for a while. So although GDP doesn't account for social service spending, we can look to it as a common standard or guide to incomes, since the majority of the population cannot have lifestyles higher than that per capita. So I share with you all the 30-year trajectory of Cuba's GDP per capita and growth rates for the past 30 years. Throughout the 2000s, it grew about 4% and has seen a pretty dramatic increase. But the main goal of this graphic is to look at the 18.17% drop in 1996 and make note of these dates in particular, because they directly correlate with acts by the US. One includes the Torricelli Act, enacted in 1992 by President George H.W. Bush right before the elections. It prevented food and medicine from being shipped to Cuba, which made measures more severe against Cuba. You can look throughout the last decade for other harmful acts towards Cuba, but this one essentially was to paralyze the Cuban economy, hoping that it would lead to Castro's fall in the 90s. And it forbade American companies from engaging in trade with Cuba. Foreign ships that used American ports could not travel there for a period of 180 days. And it also blocked cash remittances from being sent to Cuba, which are continued efforts under this administration, despite some normalization efforts by the Obama administration, including travel, which helped the Cuban economy, and things such as not labeling Cuba as a terrorist organization. But we'll get into that in the next series and the different acts with US-Cuba relations. But just as a note, this information was provided on a handout by the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective and will be available on our website at the end of the webinar. So you can have this graphic to look at, as well as this one, because this is a lot of information. But this is the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Libertad Act of 1996, also known by the name of its sponsors, the Helms-Burton Act, which imposed international sanctions against the Cuban government. It's essentially an economic embargo that any US company dealing with Cuba can be subjected to legal action, and that company's leadership can be barred from entry into the United States. Sanctions may be applied to non-US companies trading with Cuba as well. This means that internationally operating companies have to choose between Cuba and the US, which is a much larger market. So again, these will be available at the end of the webinar, but this is just a look towards the next webinar session and a look at the very harmful protectionist trade policies that the US has inflicted on Cuba and imposed on the rest of the world as well. The hardest part to read of this graphic is the map, but it shows in red, highlights in red, the countries affected by US sanctions, which are essentially a weapon of economic war, which result in chronic shortages of basic necessities. US imposed sanctions violate international law and are a tool of regime change. They impact a third of humanity in 39 countries. So the blockade doesn't just harm Cuba, it prohibits other countries from exporting, including the US. There's just so much more transportation cost. But besides the monetary losses to these sanctions, it's essentially a genocidal weapon that the US uses and has used against Cuba. That's why Cuba prefers to call it a blockade, because you're essentially, well, the US is essentially blocking essential human needs, because the first sectors affected, as you can see from this graphic, are generally medicines, the cost of food, power, water treatment, and other essential human needs. If you'd like to know more about these trade policies, you could look to our website. We have a lot of different resources on there, and learn more at sanctionskill.org as well from this very helpful infographic. We move into the special period, which is in the 90s. This is a really nice photo I took of the cooperative farm, which is a movement that sprung out of the special period, in which the cooperatives were created. I will also go into these more in the next webinar series, but just for a little bit, to follow the trajectory, there's internally, Cuba's facing coordination between state cooperatives efforts and low work productivity. There's also corruption in the economy, and they're facing a budget deficit. And externally, Cuba as a country is building socialism among global capitalism. So it's very much in need of relationship independent of economics in this period of time. Again, they have to be imaginative with different ways of structuring their land, which includes 3 different systems: the socialist, which is government run; the cooperative, which is run by communities; and self-employed, which is essentially a person with workers. And these are all based on a sustainability principle, tying their economic model with an environmental resilience. So it basically upholds that human beings have an active role in social participation and that everyone has the opportunity for leadership positions. That includes a permaculture garden, which is a grassroots response to the special period in a more urban form as well. This is also a sneak peek at El Vivero a la Mar, one of the cooperatives that we joined. In the back is the history that we'll talk about in the next series, but I really wanted to share with you all the mission, which is written in Spanish, but I translated to contribute to satisfying the needs of the population by offering a wide range of vegetable and ornamental forest medicinal plants and products derived from these productions, such as pickles and pastas. We provide other services to the community contained in our social purposes. We uphold these agricultural productions for being totally organic, applying the advances of science and technology. Likewise, we provide technical assistance and training in the national and international context. So the truth in that is we were the international context. They welcomed us into their cooperative. They showed us how they use the technology, what kind of shifts they've had to make since the special period, and pretty much how the land is managed and everyone's role in this cooperative, which was a really exciting experience, and I can't wait to talk about. Here is a video. It's really short, but it kind of shows a little bit of the layout, not all of it. I wish I had more, but it really would have taken like a bird's eye view to really show the entire layout of it. This is just a fraction of it, but there were coffee beans and mango plants that I was showing in the video. So there's some of my favorite stuff. Okay. So contrary to what maybe most people hear, Cuba's private sector exists, and entrepreneurial activity has grown out of economic reforms and a growing tourism sector, again, in part by US's efforts to normalize relations including tourism, but also the Cuban government in loosening restrictions on private sector licensing, employment, property ownership, and most notably legalizing small and medium-sized private enterprises for certain industries in 2016. An example that we got to meet with was an Afro-Cuban collective named Beyond Roots. This was a very special experience because Beyond Roots is a small business that started in a predominantly Afro-Cuban neighborhood, and they are all about embracing their Afro culture and their Afro roots, as you can see by the title Beyond Roots. And they are a group of collective artists that have used their many skills to sell and make a business out of, more importantly, their message, which is to embrace their natural features, which is often difficult to do in the global colorism that we face, which is discrimination based on the skin color. It's usually a preference for lighter skin and over darker skin. So the collective is all about Black power and spreading their message on embracing their Cubanidad first and foremost. And they've made a successful business out of it as well, going into other neighborhoods and putting on community events and shedding light on their message. It was a very meaningful experience because it really accumulates what we don't see is, the small business market in Cuba, but also empowerment at this stage in Latin America, where we oftentimes marginalize Black people. And this was very important to my friend Eliani, because we were able to bring her along, and she was able to get connected with this collective after they were supporting each other on Instagram, which is where she has her business. And her business is essentially embracing your natural hair and wraps and just different fashionistas and ways to style, and kind of sharing that on a social media platform, which is really cool. And they were able to network while we just brought her along and didn't know. On social service supports in Cuba, there's universal healthcare, universal education, subsidized food out of the cooperative movement, and housing. Overall, Cuba is a state with high investments in social services, but consumer goods are unavailable to most Cubans. So since this is the agriculture webinar, we can go into one way in which people have been able to support themselves through permaculture. So this diagram on the right is this man's permaculture garden, which is his home. The yellow looking part is his roof. So permaculture is really about maximizing the space that you have, which is the earth, and putting practical uses to this. So this urban agriculture national policy that produces 70% of the country's food needs is basically a principle that designs human settlements, like people's homes, and self-sufficiency in food, water, and energy. So yeah, the labels are in Spanish, but there are different ways I wish I could point out where his toilet was running self-sufficiently. He had something like a solar oven where he could put the bread in this case and it would be cooked by the sun. And obviously for us to be going into his space and to be seeing this is mesmerizing and amazing, but there are a lot of takeaways from this experience, because the reality is that he is maximizing his space and all that he has, and it's really his opportunity for change that emerged out of the crisis. And some of this, I'm sure, people have been able to use in our urban spaces. I live in kind of a smaller space, but a lot of the people on the delegation were very excited to take away from what he was growing. If we couldn't have like chickens and rabbits, they at least could grow similar herbs and such in their gardens. And this was one aspect of the permaculture that I think really is applicable to the whole community, was these uplifting messages that he has outside of his home. Essentially, they're all in Spanish, but we were there in 2019, and in the left image, you can see that it was started in July of 2009, and this was all of the progress that he had made in 10 years. You could see from the rooftop where I took the image on the top left, how much space and how much of the land is actually in use. So cash crops can be very risky for a country like Cuba. So this is a very sustainable option, embracing the land and bridging it with environmental efforts, because we know that export-oriented agriculture often leads to greater CO2 emissions. This is something that he took a lot of pride in, is that a lot of what he surrounded himself with is life. So it's basically what led him to advocate for love of life and love of the land. The image, or the flyer right here next to the flowers, states the fundamental principles of permaculture, which are to take care of the land, which in part is the earth, And that way we will live among the elements and to take care of others. And the last phrase is that violence interrupts cooperation and is never an opportunity. So again, this is a movement that emerged out of crisis and has been used as an opportunity for change, but the outlook is essentially to embrace life instead of to destroy. So at this part, we would like you to bridge the theory and the action that we've learned today and urge Congress and the administration to lift sanctions to help fight COVID-19. So this is a 2019 delegation, but all of the effects we're going to dive into these webinar series. And Cuba has been under US economic sanctions for over 60 years, costing the island nation billions of dollars. In the last year, the Trump administration has dramatically increased economic sanctions against Cuba, leaving them strapped for cash. Despite Cuba's strong healthcare system, their lack of access to the appropriate medical supplies is hindering their ability to treat and contain COVID-19. The international community must make every effort within its power to stop the spread of the virus, protect people, and ease the harm the virus causes. In order to do that, the United States must suspend the sanctions that are inflicting the most harm on the Cuban people. So major takeaway from Cuba is thinking about who is most affected by issues. And in the fight for COVID-19, we can look to those 59 countries that the US is economically straining, but also physically harming as we face a pandemic. So this link, as well as other resources, are again going to be available on the website. I'd like to take some time to also thank Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective for the resources that they allowed us to use today. A special thank you to Alianza for the platform, which is the webinar that you all joined today, and to my staff, Juan Carlos, Marilyn, Sharon, and Claudia, for your guys' support with the webinar today.
Okay, so thank you, Daisy. So now it's time for you to shoot your questions in. I don't see any questions. Sharon, do you have any that have come in? Okay. That's because it was such a mesmerizing presentation. And but I think if people don't have more questions, and feel free to add any questions at any time, I think we can also go into a little more depth on some of the pieces that you talked about. Also, I will remind people that I did, unbeknownst to Daisy, I did put in the, I think I finally got in the chat, the links to the additional resources and also links where you can register for the next two parts of the webinar, and the live link to take action that was in a campaign that was created by the Presbyterian Church USA. So take a look at that chat and you'll find even more information there. So Daisy, if we were going to ask you a question, what was your biggest takeaway from the trip? You said that you went trying to connect with people who are doing healing and creating nurturing communities. And what were the biggest takeaways that you had from the trip?
So there were a lot of great exercises that I learned from Witness for Peace. If anybody has ever had a chance to join, visiting a foreign country can be quite a shocking experience, especially when you're talking about these large structures. So I think I came back to the United States super prepared for what kinds of questions people might have, but most importantly, I found a community of people that I could just reach out to. And in light of these events, they've been, you know, some of the strongest support system that I have, where I can just call them up on essentially anything. And this was a particularly difficult time for me because I wasn't going to be returning back home. I was going to be going into the belly of the beast, into my semester in DC. So while I was in DC, I was interning for the House of Representatives for this great nation. And I was pretty unfamiliar with who I was interning with, but it was unknown to me like exactly what stances this person had, what they would think if I were to talk about visiting a country like Cuba in general. But as you know, any intern would, I just kind of followed everything that they had me do, while keeping in the back of my mind the commitment I made to the Cuban people, essentially, and that I had a strong support system of everybody, of those 16 people who were doing the same thing throughout the world. You know, I just got lucky that I was able to do that in Washington. And yeah, mostly the skill of being able to connect with other people on this issue, and then being able to bring it back to the US and have conversations, was very important to me personally.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Daisy, I have a question. I'm often struck by what we get on our news media are the people fleeing Cuba, trying to get here, and really bad-mouthing the regime. But I was really struck, particularly by the guy who had turned his entire property into a permaculture, with kind of pride and ingenuity and creativity with which he met his situation, and just the, I don't know, just the rich humanity and whatnot. Is that something, I don't know how much you'd seen of news footage here about Cubans, but I was just curious if you had any comments on that kind of contrast.
Yeah, I think one important thing to consider, especially when we live in the US, is who we are listening to on these issues. We have groups of people in the US that have been hurt by the country of Cuba for sure. And the ways that they've been hurt are something that you don't often hear about, though. We listen to them, and they are able to become part of our Congress and make these decisions that affect a country like Cuba without being the people affected by these policies necessarily. They also aren't, you know, currently being affected, but they also have the means to kind of enforce this US foreign policy that the Cuban people have no control over. So you might see somebody making, you know, a permaculture garden, upholding this wonderful philosophy, bridging the humanity with the land, because that's really all they have. They're making do with what they have. And if anything, that's a little bit more of a positive outlook than lobbying Congress for more harmful actions towards a country that somebody like the permaculturist is in no control over or of.
Yeah, and I would just add a couple pieces to that. I think what's amazing about Cuba is how layered it is, like how many things are true at the same time, but mostly it gets presented for our view as very this or that. So it's true, lots of people have left Cuba. And in fact, this is even true since the beginning of time, because it's an island. And so islands have people coming and going. And if you look even to the 1900s, you see a lot of movement. So, and there are people who need to leave Cuba, are faced with excruciating choices. Like I know someone who her child had asthma, and because of the embargo, she couldn't get the asthma medicine that she wanted, and she really wanted to stay in Cuba, but in the end she had to leave. So US policy is not the only reason why people leave. Some people leave because they'd rather live in New York. And the natural migration of Cubans is kind of forced into our little melodrama. Like, if anybody leaves Cuba, it means Cuba is a despotic dictatorship, rather than people move to different countries, and we're creating conditions that are push factors for people to leave Cuba. So all of these things are true at the same time, but it's hard to do that in a soundbite.
Right. Something on these push factors, I think that I was able to see that maybe other people on my delegation weren't, because of me being a young person. And when we'd go out at night with, like I said, I made a friend there who is an undergraduate studying sociology like myself at the University of Havana. So I was able to ask her and her friend group questions about what it's like being a young person growing up there. Mm-hmm. And you know, there is this, I guess, attraction to the consumer culture here, but it's not necessarily something that they'd trade their, you know, like universal rights for, their basic human needs for. But everybody has a different perspective on that. And obviously these are things that you give and take and are passed down and learned generationally as well, because they were able to see that a lot of their friends studying in other countries, the US included, maybe had a little bit of not my words, but like distorted values as a result. But like Marilyn said, people have the autonomy to do that. In the US, we kind of just label it as something else.
Any questions from the participants?
No, they don't have any questions. We have millions of questions. We never get to talk about this because we're always about delegations, because we're always like sending emergency alerts for legislation. Mm-hmm. So it's fun for us.
Or there's a pandemic and I never actually got to visit this new office I'm in.
That's right. Okay. So also on some of the, one of the slides talks about kind of the organization and leadership roles that people take in these permaculture gardens. And I think that's interesting to talk about. Kind of one example was that person who by himself is kind of creating this amazing experience. But on the slide where you have, there's a globe. Is that an individual's garden, or did you see any permaculture that was kind of more than one individual involved with it?
That photo was also taken from his garden.
Oh, okay.
But we did visit another one that day. I just, with the pictures, and you know, like being in the moment, I was kind of not all the time on my phone, but
good.
I just like, this was the first one, so I was amazed, you know. And then after that, I was just like, okay, now it's the time to soak it in and be present. But yeah, this is a very interesting movement because it's happening in cities. So the cooperative farms are mostly in the outskirts of the cities. They're happening in, you know, like large areas where they have the land. But this is, you know, as a home as the size of that pink one across from the globe. And he has just been able to maximize every single space possible. But it's, you know, he's very intertwined with his community. It doesn't just kind of stop at the fence. If he has an overgrowth of production, he would of course share it with his neighbor, or if his neighbor has, you know, some type of pain, he'll be like, use this to make a tea or something. So he's really become a leader in his community in that way. He hasn't been able to hoard all the resources because they are accessible to him. They're also accessible to the community in a way, because he's become a leader in this movement in his community and made these visuals. I think he was telling us that that visual, he was able to enter into some type of contest where it was like a permaculture contest, whose ever was like the most nicely designed and stuff. That's also why there's a little bit of an aesthetic to this one, you know. It's practical, but it's also pretty. So it's a nice urban movement because it's happening in such a confined space, but the leadership is outside of that. It's really reaching the entire community. And again, this speaks to people like us living in maybe smaller homes in the city, like myself. I'm trying to make the best use that I can with the land that I have. Obviously, it's not like I can offer my neighbor I need tomatoes anytime soon, but that would obviously be like a very practical means. And it's something as simple as knocking on their door, being like, oh, I grew too many tomatoes. Would you like some?
We have another question that's come up on the Q&A page. Did you get much of a feel for inequalities within Cuba due to some receiving remittances from the US and some not?
That's a great question. And this was a thought that I had going into Cuba because, again, I'm Mexican, so I know the effects that cash remittances have on families and the ways of life in foreign countries. But I sat next to somebody on the plane who said she was going to visit her mother, and she, really, really kind of harped me about why I was going to visit Cuba. Why would I want to visit a country like Cuba? And she said, I don't send my mom money. Instead, I come visit her because I'm trying to convince her to move to the United States. And instead of just having her live off of me, I'm, being present and trying to help her in every way possible. And I was like, that's very interesting until we can't travel to Cuba anymore. But, it was a very interesting perspective. And I didn't get to meet enough people in Cuba that were benefits of cash remittances. So I wasn't able to see the disparity, or if it exists, if there is a disparity. But I just thought that was a very interesting perspective to keep in mind going into Cuba and to be mindful of. It's a good question.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that, and these Witness for Peace delegations, a lot of times you're going to community projects like this person, and it's possible that he's getting some remittances, but a lot of the Witness for Peace projects are made up of people who are largely not getting remittances. So it kind of, in a way, they're really deeply rooted community projects. So that's kind of a wonderful thing about their trips. But I do know that the inequalities are growing as that's a bad effect of US sanctions as well, is that as it becomes harder and harder for people to make it in Cuba, the people who have money from the outside live really well, and they can purchase things that require harder currency. So, and that has a racial impact in that most of the people who left Cuba in the, at least the ones that left in the 60s, were lighter skinned. It's not the case now, like through the 90s and above, but so a lot of darker skinned Cubans don't have family on the exterior. They call it FE, Familia Exterior, or something like that. So I know from other sources that, it's further exacerbating racial issues, while at the same time there's a very deep and ongoing conversation about race in Cuba. It's another way that U.S. policy exacerbates issues that are already there.
I want to ask you a question, Daisy. What from your experience do you recall most often and would like to, I don't know, put into practice or continue using in some way or just use as inspiration?
Besides the sustainable use of land that I've tried to, I mean, like, I definitely want to start a farm now. This has been really interesting, and I've constantly made connections that I'm surprised by. I could not think about each day by day anymore. I have to think of every instance by as it comes up. So besides the idea of community advocacy, I think the major takeaways are everything that has to do with what we are undergoing currently, crises in our healthcare system, and current civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, making these connections to a post-revolutionary country like Cuba, and seeing the things that could come out of the hardship is basically my passion and my motivation right now, understanding that it has to be hard before it gets better. And essentially the idea of healing, trying to heal our nation in many ways, or repair or instate these broken criminal justice structures, broken healthcare systems that I think I became aware don't actually exist. And we need to be more creative in the ways that we are managing these systems.
We have another question. One of our participants says, I was in Cuba in 2019, and there were many tourists from the US, and it was people involved in tourism who were able to earn more money even than doctors and college professors. Has that changed since Trump took over?
They were in Cuba in 2019?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. From my experience speaking to one professor, it hasn't changed. It has changed, but it's always been difficult. She doesn't benefit from remittances, so she's kind of having a hard time racking up some money for a trip to New York. I'll have to check in with her on how that's going, but she's a retired professor who receives pension and is on the side doing some tutoring and basically managing 3 jobs while receiving her pension. And her view on Trump was not necessarily due to the foreign policy, but more so just whatever's going on in the US. I think somebody like a doctor and professor will have a little bit of knowledge on what's going on in the US and how his policy is affecting us. So that was the most input that I've gotten on what people thought of our administration. Other than that, I didn't really ask what people thought of Trump or Trump's policies on Cuba.
And I could just add a little bit on travel. Traveling to Cuba is, over the last 25 years, has gone through millions of changes. But right now, people can travel. Well, now you can't travel because we're having a pandemic. But prior to the pandemic, people in certain categories could travel. So, but the process of making categories is also an exercise in class, because you want to just go. You can't just go. You have to be in one of these organized trips, some of which are $3,000 or $4,000. So even the simple thing of making categories is a form of limitation. But, and I think to the question of the tourist economy, I think this is a challenge. Like a friend of mine in Cuba, she had been a diplomat and she hoped that her son would follow in that path. And he decided that he would become an auto mechanic because then he was going to fix the cars of foreigners, some of whom live in Cuba, plus drive people around, and would make, you know, quadruple what she had made as a diplomat. So it's a reality of, you know, tourism is what kept Cuba from collapsing, but it also produces all kinds of distortions in the life of the people.
Marilyn, I have one more question. How has US policy changed since Obama kind of created diplomatic relations with Cuba? What has Trump succeeded in reversing some of those policies, and which ones?
Daisy, do you want to share parts of your experience that apply to that? And then I'll jump in after that.
Yeah, without spoiling too much of US-Cuba relations, which is next week's webinar. We'll talk about the specific acts and stuff. I have.
Okay, we can wait till next week.
We have an immense list to share with everybody. Don't worry, we'll go through a timeline. But yeah, things such as labeling Cuba a terrorist organization that, sorry, not terrorist organization, terrorist country, that Obama was trying to kind of work on relations-wise. There have been things such as lawsuits, which, you know, the US knows best, trying to, or granting people who migrated from Cuba the right to sue for their land in Cuba is something that's affecting Cuban citizens, obviously. But yeah, Trump was able to reinstate that, or has been able to give major companies the ability to do that. So if you're interested in looking into that, I think it's called the Fifth something. I'm sorry, I get them all mixed up, but I'll be sure to include all of these with the correct names and dates into all these.
Yeah, and I think that in the links that are in the chat, there's a couple timelines that people can take a look at. But I think in the big picture, you know, when we talk about, well, let's just call the Obama administration a thaw. We didn't really normalize relations because we still had an embargo. But we had an administration that stopped full-time trying to destroy Cuba. And instead signed lots of agreements, including agreements on environmental cooperation, medical cooperation. So it was a climate where you could actually pursue things. So when Trump came in as part of his agenda to destroy everything that was good and positive that was happened during the Obama administration, he set out systematically to roll back most of those changes. He hasn't been successful. Like, the embassies are still open. There's still people, for instance, doing medical trials under the medical cooperation. So there's pieces of work that are still going on, but you know, he systematically, by one way or the other, tried to roll back most of the thaw and installed people who are full-time trying to figure out, like, oh, we're having a, you know, pandemic. Cuban doctors are in 31 countries. And now the US is trying to penalize the countries that get help from Cuban doctors, like threatening their foreign aid if they have a Cuban medical brigade come there, although the US isn't offering them any medical brigades to take the place. So we can just say that the atmosphere is back to full-time plus trying to destroy this project in Cuba. But despite all this, there's still lots of people pushing forward with, you know, university relationships, medical, scientific, even drug interdiction methods. You know, so there's an insistent will of people in both places to keep connection and make sensible relationships. And that's been true really since, you know, the 60s.
Yeah, there's been a lot of congressional support to lift the blockade as well. CRLN's trying to join in on some city council as well. I just fear there's not enough of it. And of course, with a power like, you know, the presidential branch, there's just so much more that they have exerted than that most of the general population disagrees with. And I think you can find that a lot of people would say that it's time to lift that blockade.
Yeah, it enjoys really, even in what were considered hardcore communities in Dade County, pretty much 60% of the people polled think the embargo should be ended. So a lot of these politico types on the Hill talk about this is basically an election issue that has to do with getting campaign contributions in Florida. So it's really a domestic issue in the US rather than an sensible international policy issue.
Right.
But we'll dig into that further and look at next week at kind of what are the effects of kind of rolling back the thaw and how does that affect Cubans?
And our outlook on Cuba personally, and, you know, as Americans, how does that affect our outlook on Cuba?
Okay, well, we're at 8:03, and so I think we will wrap up. And I want to once again thank everybody who joined, and big shout out to Daisy, who, when we can't go anywhere, brought us a wonderful trip and helped us dive behind the headlines to get into, you know, the things that never show up on the daily news. So, and thanks to both Sharon and Juan Carlos for the help, and again to Alianza for the platform. So in the chat, you'll find the link to register for the next 2 webinars if you haven't already. So do join us, and you can share that link with friends that you think would be interested. And we'll look forward to seeing many of you next Thursday. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.